Oh my goodness, y'all. It's time to talk about the establishment of maritime empires, and this is a beefy one, so gird thyself. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So in the last video, we witnessed various European states dipping their toes in the pool of sea-based trading networks throughout the Indian Ocean. But it didn't take long for them to decide that the water was just fine and to cannonball in the middle of everybody's crap and get busy on a full-blown empire-building project. And what were their motives for doing so, says you? Well, it's complicated, says I, but we can essentially reduce their motivations to gold, God, and glory, which created no small amount of rivalry between them. In other words, European states began developing maritime empires because they wanted to enrich themselves, and because they wanted all the world's heathens to worship Jesus, and because they wanted to be the greatest state in the world. Oh, and if you want note guides to follow along with this video and all my videos, check that link in the description. Anyway, let's get familiar with these European powers and their efforts to take over the world. First up was the Portuguese, who became the first to establish what became known as a trading post empire around Africa and throughout the Indian Ocean. And they were largely able to do this, if you'll recall from my 4.2 video, by noticing that many of the average merchant ships in the area were pretty lightly armed. And so the Portuguese went ahead and loaded their caravels and their carracks with giant honking guns and established their dominance. And the key thing to remember here is that once the Portuguese inserted themselves into this trading network, they weren't as interested in participating peacefully as they were in owning and controlling it by force. Next came the Spanish, who early on set up their base of operations in the Philippines. And their methods were a little different from the Portuguese. What I mean is, while the Portuguese were generally content to set up and run small trading posts in these various places, the Spanish went ahead and established full-blown colonies. And if you remember, again from 4.2, how the Spanish ran their colonies in the Americas, namely through tribute systems and taxation and coerced labor, then it shouldn't surprise you that they use those exact same tactics in their colonial holdings throughout the Indian Ocean. And then we get the Dutch entering the Indian Ocean trade. And with their fancy schmancy flouts, they took over as the kings of the Indian Ocean trade, deposing the Portuguese quick, fast, and in a hurry. Kiss my grits, look at them Dutch flouts. Well, butter my backside and call me a biscuit. I guess we're done, y'all. Pack it up. Anyway, the Dutch used many of the same methods as the Portuguese to establish their dominance and control over this trade network. And finally, we have the British, and while they would later end up controlling the largest sea-based empire in the world, they had a little trouble getting started. And they had their eyes on India, but as it turned out, they lacked sufficient military power to take it from the Mughal Empire. So they satisfied themselves by setting up a few trading posts along the coast. But I should mention that later in the 18th century, toward the end of our period, the British would gradually transform those trading posts into full-blown colonial rule in India. And just for poops and giggles, I should mention that the Dutch did the same in Indonesia. Now, here's where I tell you that although European domination of the Indian Ocean trade introduced a significant change, there was also significant continuity as well. For example, the Middle Eastern, South Asian, East Asian, and Southeast Asian merchants who had been using the trade network for centuries before the arrival of the Europeans, well, they continued to use it. In fact, European entrance into this trade network increased profits not only for Europeans, but also for many of those merchants who had always used this network for trade. Additionally, long-established merchants like the Gujaratis in the Mughal Empire continued to make use of the Indian Ocean trade even while Europeans sought to dominate, and in doing so, they increased their power and wealth. Okay, now I hope you don't have the impression that all the Asian states that had participated in the Indian Ocean trade for centuries were happy about this European intrusion and their attempts to dominate long-standing trade arrangements. Don't be crazy. No, there were significant attempts to resist, and I'll mention two of those attempts. First, we saw resistance in Tokugawa, Japan. Now, the short story is that by the early 1600s, Japan, which had previously been weakened by metric buttloads of internal fracturing, was united under a shogun from the Tokugawa clan. And while the shogun was initially kind of open to trading with Europeans, he soon realized that they were in fact a threat to the hard-won unification that they had just achieved. As you may remember, many European merchants and explorers weren't just content to buy and sell goods from these various places. Many also sought to convert those various peoples to Christianity. And so by the second half of the 16th century, lots of Japanese people had converted to Christianity, and that seemed to the shogun like a recipe for a renewed cultural fracturing. And so he went ahead and expelled all Christian missionaries from Japan and suppressed the faith within Japan, often with violence. And then a second example of resistance came from Ming China. And remember that the voyages of Zheng He took place during the Ming era. And among the many motives for these voyages, among the most important was essentially to create a situation in which most of the maritime trade in the Indian Ocean was processed through the Chinese state. I mean, ultimately it didn't work, and the result was a series of isolationist trade policies that largely shut down sea-based trade in China. And when the Portuguese came to China in the early 1500s to trade, they were only able to do so through bribery and various underhanded tactics. But soon Ming officials found out and expelled them, which further isolated China from the growing European dominance in the Indian Ocean. Okay, now as we've seen throughout this course, trade networks have a way of promoting the growth of certain states who participate in them. And that was definitely the case for two African states that you need to know. First, meet the Asante Empire in West Africa. Now, they were a key trading partner with the Portuguese and later the British by providing highly desired goods like gold and ivory and enslaved laborers. And as it turned out, this economic partnership made the Asante stupid rich and enabled them to expand their military and further further expand and consolidate their power throughout the region. And kind of like a bonus, the Asante used that power and military might later to repel the British from colonizing the region for a long time. And then second, meet the Kingdom of the Congo down here in the south. Now, they made strong diplomatic ties to Portuguese traders who were highly desirous to obtain gold and copper and again enslaved people from this state. In order to further facilitate this growing economic relationship, the king converted to Christianity, as did most of the nobles. And although it probably won't surprise you to know that this relationship later deteriorated, still that economic connection between Portugal and the Kingdom of the Congo massively enriched the African state. Okay, now we've seen how things are going in this part of the world, but let's not forget that Europeans were equally busy building their empires over here in the Americas too. And over in the Americas, colonial economies were largely structured around agriculture, and in case you didn't know, crops don't plant and harvest themselves. So in order to keep this agricultural economy purring, Europeans made use of both existing labor systems and they introduced new ones, and I reckon some examples are in order. In terms of existing labor systems, the Spanish made use of the old Inca Midas system. And in case you forgot, the Inca developed this system in which subjects of the empire were required to provide labor for state projects a certain number of days per year. And then when the Spanish showed up to these areas, they pooped their pantaloons when they discovered the amount of silver buried in the hills. And so they needed to figure out how to get enough laborers to dig all that sweet bling out of the mountains, and when they learned about the Midas system, they were like, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's a rough translation from the Spanish. Anyway, they went ahead and implemented the Midas system largely for their massive silver mining operations. But now, in terms of introducing new labor systems to the Americas, they went hog wild, and there are 4 of them you need to know. First was race-based chattel slavery. As you already know by now, enslaved Africans were transported by the millions throughout the Americas, mainly in order to work on sprawling plantations. Now, chattel is a word that means property, and it meant that these laborers were owned as any other piece of property was owned and could be used at the will of the owner. And what was new about all this arrangement was, first of all, the race-based part, and second of all, slavery became hereditary, so that the children of enslaved people would become enslaved themselves. Now, the second new labor system introduced was indentured servitude. An indenture was a contract, and a laborer would sign that contract, which bound them to a particular work for a period of time, usually 7 years. And many poorer Europeans entered this kind of agreement in order to pay for their passage to the colonies, and then after their indenture was up, they could go free and live their lives. And then the third system you need to know was the encomienda system. Now, it was the Spanish who cooked this form of labor up, and it was used to coerce indigenous Americans into working for colonial authorities. Essentially, indigenous people were forced to provide labor for the Spanish in exchange for food and protection, which was similar in a lot of ways to the old system of feudalism in Europe. But call it what you want, it wasn't that materially different from slavery. And fourth, we have another gem from the Spanish, namely the hacienda system. Now, basically, haciendas were large agricultural estates owned by elite Spaniards and on which indigenous laborers were forced to work the fields, whose crops were then exported and sold on a global market. If you just grew a question mark over your head because that sounds pretty similar to the encomienda system, let me try to clear up the difference. Encomienda was more focused on controlling the population, while hacienda was more focused on the economics of food export. And finally, we need to talk about the development of slavery in this period, and let's talk about how it demonstrated both continuity and change. On the continuity side, you need to realize that the African slave trade was not a new development that came with the rise of these maritime empires. No, way before our period, the trade of enslaved African people was a regular feature in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean networks. And so enslaved people in those networks were often assimilated into the cultures into which they were sold. In the Islamic world, the majority of enslaved Africans became domestic servants in households, and for those roles, the demand was very high for enslaved women and girls. Additionally, in some cases in the Islamic world, enslaved people could hold significant military or political positions. And so it's important to remember that all of these realities continued during the rise and establishment of maritime empires. But let's talk change now, and mostly the change occurred in the Americas. First, because the main economic engine of imperial empires in the Americas was difficult agricultural work, Europeans purchased male slaves 2-to-1, which significantly impacted the demographics of various African states. Second, the size of the transatlantic slave trade was far more massive than its Indian Ocean and Mediterranean counterparts. Over the course of about 350 years, over 12.5 million Africans were sold to plantation owners in the Americas. And then third and most distinctive was the racial component of the Atlantic slave trade. In the Americas, slavery became identified with blackness, and that provided the justification for the brutality of slavery. To be identified as black was to be less than human, and to be less than human meant that plantation owners could treat their workers with violence and keep a clear conscience. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 4, and click here if you want to grab my video note guides. They're really helpful for students who hate reading their textbook but still need to get all the content of their course firmly crammed into their brain folds. Anyway, thanks for hanging out, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.